Thank you, Sally. When Larry emailed me and asked me if I would do a plenary talk here, he didn't tell me that there was an award associated with it, and he certainly didn't tell me that it was this award. And I'm grateful to Larry and Sally and to the board for this recognition, and I'm grateful because it feels personal. It feels personal because it's part of this organization that's an organization of doers, of people that aren't afraid to take on the tough challenges and to look forward toward the big opportunities. And I'm actually grateful to be mentioned in the same breath as Barbara Starfield, who I think all of us consider directly or indirectly a mentor. It's Barbara's work that really shows what's important about what we do. Her research has shown that primary care, that systems that are based on primary care are associated with healthier populations, with less health inequality, and with financing and with costs that are actually sustainable, that leave some resources for some of the social and environmental determinants of health. Barbara's work also is relevant to the topic that I'm going to be talking about today, because she taught us about the 4 C's, the things we do that are the mechanisms by which some of those good outcomes happen. And those C's are continuity, a relationship focus for care; comprehensiveness, a focus on the whole person; coordination and integration of care; and a first-person contact, accessibility to people and to the populations. She both showed us the outcome of what we do and showed us what is important and how we get to that. And then finally, I didn't actually know that until just last week about this, and until Rika Mayashiro told me yesterday that there's something in the book from Will Miller. I didn't know about that. And so it's personal to me because Will and I have been on this journey together for more than 2 decades. And the work that Will does, he understands the heart and soul of family medicine. So it's a joy to be mentioned with him. So I'm going to talk about the science of connectedness and a science of emergence. And those 2 words are really behind a lot of what we do that's of value. It's about the connections, it's about the relationships we have with individuals. But as we've heard as a real theme of this meeting, it's about the connections with our healthcare system, and even more than that, about our connections with the community. And it's about the idea of emergence, about the idea that something happens, that the magic of primary care that Sally mentioned. There's some emergent property that happens beyond what we do, treating one disease at a time, with a focus on the whole person, even beyond what we do, treating one person at a time. And so that's what I'd like to talk about. And I want to just talk a bit about this problem of not understanding what's important about family medicine. Every group feels that no one outside their group understands them. And that's certainly more true for us than for a lot of groups. My concern, though, is that as we start to get some power again, like we did during the managed care era, that we are at risk for being co-opted, that we're at risk for starting to less and less understand what's important about what we do and to take on what the rest of the world thinks that's important about what we do. And so how we're misunderstood often is that what we do is simple, often simplistic. I mean, how ironic that we take the most complex task in healthcare to integrate and personalize and prioritize care for individuals and families and communities. How ironic that we take that and try to cram that into 10 minutes. Healthcare in the U.S. is about delivering commodities of care. It's about buying and selling commodities of care. And we have to be careful that we don't get co-opted into that, even as people are willing to pay us a little bit more for delivering those commodities of care. We do deliver commodities of care, but we do something more, and we have to keep our eye on what's the something more that we do that's important. And then this idea that if we just get all the parts right, the care of individual diseases, that somehow the whole person or the whole community will be better. That's how we approach pay for performance. That's how we approach our quality measures. And we just have to be careful that that's not how we think of ourselves, that we don't get deluded by the kind of theory that's underneath that if you just get all the parts right, that the whole has to be better. It's not true. And so what are the consequences of some of this misunderstanding? It's fragmentation. It's a fragmented healthcare system. It's a depersonalized healthcare system. The experience of patients with healthcare in the U.S. now is of a fragmented, broken system that's very depersonalized. It's a very lonely experience getting healthcare in the U.S. And we're the people that have actually been buffering that fragmented system. We've been enabling that fragmented system to keep limping along. And somehow we have to find a place between what we do to just help people get through the days, to get through what they need in that fragmented system, and at the same time work to radically change that system. And that's the big tension that we have, that healthcare in the U.S. has right now. And the consequences of this fragmented, depersonalized approach are a system that's incredibly inefficient and actually quite ineffective. And I'm not going to show you the usual slides about how ineffective the U.S. healthcare system is. So that's the problem that we're facing, and we just have to make sure that we remain part of the solution, that we don't get co-opted. And so what I'd like to do for this plenary time today is I'd actually like to ask you to please co-create this with me. I thought that Brownwood's story that we heard was just beautiful, and I'd like you to actually to think with me about your own stories of health and healing. And in a minute, I'm going to give you some time to do that. And then what I'd like to spend my time and some slides doing is just providing a few lenses with which to look at your own stories. And one lens will be that of healing relationships and some research on that. Two different perspectives on the generalist approach, what we do when we're acting and thinking like generalists. A holarchy of healthcare. A holarchy is a hierarchy where the higher levels transcend but include the levels below that. And I think there's something useful to thinking about the different aspects of care as a holarchy. I'll talk about some different ways of knowing and understanding what we do. Briefly mention some cycles of change and mention this initiative in promoting health across boundaries. So this is the initial co-creation part of the plenary. And I'd like you to imagine a specific instance for yourself when you felt most effective, working with or in family medicine, when you were helping an individual or a family or a community toward healing or health. A time when your best attributes were brought to bear, perhaps working with others, probably working with others, that made a difference in the life of an individual, a family, or a community. And the essay that we heard by Brownwood talked about the need for reflection. So I'd like you to actually take a minute and reflect on this. Try to make this story, think of something real for yourself, and think of what it felt like when you were in the moment, what happened, what it smelled like, what it was like to be that. It might be a particular instant, it might be something that happened over time. I'd just like to give you a minute to think about that, please. I think you're mostly sitting with people you know, but I'd actually like to have us take a few minutes and have you share that story with someone next to you. If there's someone next to you that you don't know, that. So I want to ask you to do something a little hard. In one word, that experience that you just were talking about, what was that like? Emotional. Trust. Compassion. Listening to patients. This is an overachieving table here. One word? Wit? With. Present. Validating. Wow, larger multi-generational relationships. And how about just the experience of thinking about that, or telling the story, or hearing someone else's story in one word? What was that like? Goosebumps with us. Pride? Pride. Encouraging. Understanding. Love? Let's end on love. I almost didn't make that. That was really close. Okay. So I'd like you to keep those stories in mind, either the one you heard or the one you thought of for yourself, and let's just look at those with some different lenses. And the first lens I want to think about is the lenses of healing relationships. And I want to call on some work that Tom Agnew did. He published in 2 articles in the Annals of Family Medicine, where he studied people. He asked people what they meant by healing. And what he concluded is that people meant by healing the transcendence of suffering. That was kind of a revelation for me. It made sense when I read it, but it was kind of a revelation for me. And then John Scott did some research in New Jersey where he found some exemplary family physicians and asked them to interview them. And then he asked them to identify patients that had had healing. And he didn't tell either group what healing was, but they seemed to know what it was. And what they said is that healing was cure when that's possible. And when that's not possible, they also came up with this idea of transcendence of suffering. And so when John looked at that a little bit more and analyzed what was involved in developing those healing relationships, he found there were 3 basic processes. The first was valuing. It was having a non-judgmental stance when we approach people or communities. It was connecting, finding a way to connect on a personal level. And it was having a presence, of giving full attention, of paying attention to the illness experience, and of suffering with the patient. And then appreciating power. And it's interesting, he didn't say using your power, he said appreciating power. And that involves partnering with people, it involves educating. And then sometimes, and this is difficult for us in family medicine because we tend to be conflict avoidant, it involves pushing. It involves pushing people beyond their comfort zone and often beyond our comfort zone. And when we're moving beyond our work with individual people to our community and healthcare system work, I think we need to do some of these 3 things if we're going to heal our healthcare system, and we need to be open to using our power to push things. And then it's this idea of abiding, of sticking with people, of being accessible, about being there for major events for people, even if you're not physically present, of following up on them. A commitment to not giving up, and just showing caring by your actions, that together these led to healing relationships. And the competencies that he found that we needed to do this were to have some self-confidence. We need to have some self-esteem for what we're doing this, and we need to build on that from thinking about these peak experience stories like the ones we just thought about. We need to be good at emotional self-management. We need to be mindful, and we need to know stuff. And the outcomes of this process then are a sense of hope, trust, and being known. And so that's what people experience that are experiencing healing, is a sense of hope, even at the end of life, a sense of trust, and a sense of being known. So it's interesting just to think about the stories that we have with this lens of healing. Another lens I'd like to look at are 2 streams that actually ask us to see things when we're wearing our generalist hat. And the first one I'll present is some work that Jane Gunn in Australia has done. She did a systematic review of generalism and found that generalists have a particular way of being that leads to a certain way of knowing and certain ways of doing. And here's how she diagrammed that. She said that this generalist way of being involves being reflexive. What Browning's story told us this morning, she took moments to be reflective. Having interpretive processes where we try to make sense of things, where we get data we process, where we try to make sense of things. And I wish she'd named this differently, but something that she called virtuous character, which I wrote down what that is. It involves compassion, tolerance, empathy, respect, and being trustworthy. So this is our way of being when we're acting like generalists. And that leads to certain generalist ways of doing that are about being accessible, about taking time with people, about paying attention to context. Part of the problems that we have with research is that most of the research methods that we have specifically decontextualize things. And yet most of the things that we do in family medicine, context is important. And so as our discipline moves forward, we're trying to move forward with generating new knowledge in a way that's about understanding things in their context. And then there's a certain approach that we've been talking about this whole conference. And that leads to what Iona Heath called a balance between a biotechnical way of knowing, what we spend most of our time in medical school teaching people, and a biographical way of knowing, something that we start learning more when we're in practice, when we have a chance to develop relationships over time with people, and something that we try to really teach to complement the biographical and the biotechnical in our ways of training. And it's not, this isn't actually in balance. The balance kind of goes back and forth. At the same time Jane was doing this work in Australia, I was taking a little time trying to look outside of healthcare at how we act when we're acting as generalists, and then try to apply that to what we do in healthcare. And what was interesting is that I ended up coming with a similar frame, that when we're acting like generalists, there's a certain way of being, of knowing, perceiving, and then of thinking and doing. And Will Miller actually is the one whom he saw this pointed out to me. He said, yes, and that starts off with a certain baseline of recognition or connectedness, how we're part of a community, how we're part of a larger cosmos, and that recognition is then what sets us up for these different ways of being, knowing, perceiving, thinking, and doing. And so the generalist way of being is how we get ready for acting like generalists. It involves an open stance, a stance that's open not just to what we bring to an encounter, but to what the other brings to the encounter, and the idea that we'll co-create knowledge. It involves being humble, and if you go into family medicine and you're not humble to begin with, you have humbleness thrust upon you at times. But it ends up being a real strength, actually. And think of the times, if I'd asked you to think of stories where things didn't go well, it probably was a time when we were a little bit too full of ourselves. And so this humility actually can be a real strength that leads to listening and a lot of other good things. And it leads to connection via key relationships. And the key relationships are on the front lines of our dysfunctional healthcare system as we interact with individuals and families and communities, and then a relationship with the healthcare system and doing that connection. So we get ready for being a generalist by having this open stance, by being humble, and by developing connections. And then the way we train for being a generalist is to develop broad knowledge and then have some grounding in specific knowledge. So we know the specifics of our discipline of family medicine, and yet we need to develop broad knowledge too of ourselves, of others, of the systems around us and how the natural world works and how those things are connected. And that leads to a generalist way of perceiving how we see the world in ways that foster integration. And I don't know if it came through in your personal stories, but when I talk to people about when they're acting like generalists, there's this scanning function and then prioritizing that happens, and then focusing down on the highest priority. With a general internist who was a fellow of mine a couple years ago, Sherry Boland at Metro, we have a paper that's actually in the process of being rejected at all the best journals. In fact, it's one of two papers I had rejected last week by the Annals of Family Medicine that I edit. And I think that's how it is with new things that I think are doing things that are really important. What Sherry did is she looked at detail in what happens during visits by diabetic patients in the Metro healthcare system, and found that in these visits, an average of 25 problems is addressed. I'd done research before and I found 5. But I had a little bit of a biomedical lens, but she found that there are all these things that are woven in there. You just ask about what medicines they're taking. Well, they can't take them. Well, why can't they take them? You know, they got kicked out of their house, or there's this and that, and you weave your way around. You're constantly prioritizing, listening. What's the most important thing that I can work on here? What might make a difference at this moment in time? And that doesn't show up in any of the guidelines. It turns out that these encounters that we looked at scored well on our use of quality of care measures. But when I looked at them, I saw that quality of care was all this other stuff that we don't really have a way of measuring. Anyway, we scan, we prioritize, we focus on what Ian McWhinney called the particulars while keeping the whole in view. And then this generalized way of thinking and doing is working on those most important parts in context, doing multiple lower-level tasks to enable those higher-level integrative actions over time. So when I talked with Al Kadesky, who now practices at the Cleveland Clinic, was our residency director at University Hospitals for a while and was my doctor, we found that sometimes we both cut patients' toenails. And we don't get paid much for cutting patients' toenails. And it's usually to refer to a podiatrist, and that's mostly what we do. But every now and then we cut our patients' toenails. And when Al told me what he did, I said, that's why I do it too. So he spreads something on the ground. He spreads a cloak on the ground. Patient sitting on the exam table, he and I both sit on the floor, and cut the toenails. And it's like when I'm in a car ride with my teenage son when I was taking him to college. When we're both looking ahead, that's where the stuff kind of comes out. So the patient's looking over me, they're above me, and that's when the stuff comes out, when I'm not focusing on my agenda, or she's not trying to get something to my attention. So we do these mundane, lower-level tasks, the reasons that people think what we do is simple. And over time, that adds up. It builds relationship, it builds knowledge, it builds understanding. So when the chips are really down, we've got some knowledge and some relationship to build on when the tough decisions need to be made. So this generalist approach then is a way of being that's open, humble, and connected. It's a way of knowing that iterates between the whole and the particulars. It's a way of seeing the world that's about scanning and prioritizing, and then a way of thinking and doing that's working in the most important tasks in that larger context. So I want to talk about this idea of a holarchy of healthcare, a way of understanding the different functions that we do in healthcare, and particularly in family medicine. And I think it's helpful sometimes to think about what we do when we're delivering fundamental care, integrative care, prioritized care, and then healing and transcendence. And so Marge Bowman showed you Maslow's triangle. This is not Maslow, but I found it useful to think about in a triangle. So this lowest level down here at the bottom, I call fundamental care. And it's what we do when we're caring for acute illness, what the patient came in. It's this kind of proactive management of prevention and chronic illness, patient concerns, psychosocial care. And that's the dance we're doing now, and why we have so much tension is that we used to just do this reactive thing to patients, what patients came in with. Now we have all this proactive prevention and chronic disease management we're trying to do, and we're trying to do the dance between our agenda and the patient's agenda, and always find the sweet spot over time, develop systems that support those proactive things that we do, at the same time not getting in the way of systems to support those reactive things that we do. So that's the basic stuff, and that's hard enough, and that's what we know how to measure a little bit when we're measuring our quality of care. Then there's integrating care. And I think it's helpful to think of integration different than coordination. Coordinating care is what we do with people, helping them work through the larger healthcare system. Integration of care is what we do when we're trying to bring together what we do for people's acute illness and their often multiple chronic illnesses, and prevention and mental health, and managing all this multimorbidity. And it's a challenging and really exciting and fun task, because you've got a lot on the plate and you're trying to figure out what's the most useful thing I could do here. And our quality measures are blind to this higher level function that we do. In our electronic medical records, our information systems could help this. I mean, what if it presented information to us not as a one disease at a time prompt, but what if it kind of prioritized the proactive agenda based on epidemiological data and the patient's clinical information? And what if we had just a few things about what the patient thinks are important that gets put in that? And what if the systems actually helped us with this function? Right now, this is the art of medicine, but it really could be something that we're supported in and that's valued. And then there's prioritized care that's integrating the biotechnical and the biographical. And the dirty little secret is that we don't just do that for individuals, we do that for the family. And when we're prioritizing how we spend every moment, we're actually prioritizing that for the healthcare system. And that's one of the added values that we do, is giving us a chance to think beyond the individual to our collective whole. And then what Egnew and Scott talked about with this healing and transcendence, what we do when we're trying to foster healing. And then there's something about sticking with people even when healing can't be fostered. And those of you who precept, or those of you who see patients, if you precept, I'm sure every now and then have a resident come into you and say, I don't know why this patient keeps coming back to me. I'm just not doing anything for them. And so what do we usually say? You say, yes, you are. You're doing something. You just don't know what it is yet. But the patient's getting something out of coming back to see you. So sticking with people, even when we don't have something that we think we're doing, when that seems to be providing value for people, is a higher order function. So it's interesting to maybe think about your stories with this lens, and as we're trying to improve what we do, as we're trying to become patient-centered medical homes, as we're developing systems so that NCQA can recognize us for what we do in this fundamental care, it's worthwhile thinking about how we can also set up systems that enable and foster and support the higher order functions that we do, because that's where the added value really is. Oh, and Will Miller calls the bottom line physician-centered care, the next one patient-centered care, the next one goal-oriented care, and then the highest level is relationship-centered care. So Sally mentioned the Future Family Medicine Project, and I was asked to write the research paper for a conference called the Keystone 3 Conference that led to the Future Family Medicine Project that led to the National Demonstration Project. And I said, oh, what a deadly thing to do, to have to be the one giving the research talk. Nobody wants to hear the research talk. And the setup for this conference was that it was a multi-generational conference. So they had the pioneers, the people who came out of general practice to start our discipline, who are largely dying off, but they were there at the conference to provide wisdom. We had the young generation that was really the future, and that are kind of the settlers, and then the intermediate generation that I'm of, the kind of homesteaders. And they said, well, you can work with Ian McWhinney on this, but he said he can't do it. I said, oh, I don't know Ian McWhinney, but he's a hero like Barbara Starfield. He's one who really talks to us about the fundamentals of what we do. And so I called Ian up and said, if I just come and type, will you talk to me and we'll do this paper that way? And he said, sure. And so we did that, and I got Will to come with us. And when we were driving back from the airport, Will and I flew up just for a day to London, Ontario, where Ian is. And I was sitting in the back seat, Ian was driving, and Ian was just reading a book by a modern philosopher named Ken Wilber. And Will had just read a little bit of that, and I felt like I was watching a ping pong match as they talked back and forth about it. And we decided that that's how we were going to organize the paper, because Wilber talks about different ways of knowing the world and says there's actually 4 ways of knowing. He says there's an inner reality, the things we know from our personal experience. And then there's an outer reality, what's the so-called objective world that we know from what's out there. And there's actually 2 different ways of understanding these and perceiving these. There's what we understand as an individual, and there was how we understand these things collectively. And so Wilber calls this kind of inter-individual reality the I reality. And this collective reality, the we reality. And the outer reality, the its or the it reality. And the reason that this seemed like a good way to organize the research paper is that we think of biomedical research, and we think actually of why historically as a discipline we haven't been very research focused, is this is where almost all research is done, is this kind of outer individual reality, is how do molecules work? What are the basic physiological and biological processes? And that's really important. But there are other ways of knowing, there are other ways, things that are happening at the same time as those biological processes are going on. And if we ignore them, we really lose important context for applying this knowledge. Well, and then we started doing research about this kind of collective outer reality, and that's where a lot of health services research comes. But more and more in family medicine, we're looking at how do we work together? And that's a lot of participatory research that we do. And then there's this individual inner reality, and it's the reflection that we do. And so we can apply these ways of knowing to health and healthcare and think about this inner reality as the view of the patient, the clinician, our colleagues, the policymakers. The we reality is how we work in teams. This its reality is how our systems are organized, and the it reality is disease and treatment. And sometimes I find it helpful to think about what I'm doing, and if things aren't going well with a patient or things aren't going well with some community work, I ask myself, am I unbalanced in how I'm approaching this? Am I focusing on one box more than the other? I find this actually helpful in my personal life as well. There's also different ways of developing those different ways of knowing, and it's relevant for the information age as we're just overwhelmed with data. But there's a hierarchy from data to information to knowledge to understanding. And so as we're thinking about our personal development in this I category, I think it's helpful to think about how are we going to develop from just having information to how do we get that to knowledge, and how do we get that to a point where there's some shared understanding? Because in that space, there's a chance to be open to wisdom. Sorry, this is kind of egg-headed talk now. So thinking about different ways of knowing, this is the next to last one. I want to use some information from ecology and economics. There's a group of investigators led by Gunderson and Holling that have come up with a way at looking at how systems change over time. And when we think about how we think about change, we often use metaphors to talk about that, and our metaphors belie how we think about the world. So we say things like the pendulum is swinging back. things are coming full circle now. The feculent material is about to hit the fan. So our metaphor is to talk about how we understand the world. And what Gunderson and Holling did is looked at ecological systems and how they change. And they don't change in pendulums. They change in this kind of Mobius strip way. And it starts with this phase they call exploitation, which is like what happens in a forest after a forest fire. So all the plants that couldn't grow anymore because the tall trees were blocking up the light, now there's all this sun, there's this nutrients because all these other things have crisped up. There's nutrients in the soil, the rain can get in there, and all sorts of things sprout. And there's this phase of incredible growth, and as that growth happens, there's an increase in the potential in the system and an increase in connectiveness. And actually, as growth happens, a reduction in resilience in the system. And so this growth happens like in a forest where you get these little plants happening, the animals start coming back, and the trees start happening, and then you get the winners. There are certain ones that win, and they get to dominate the system, and you get a lot of tinder that gets ready there for the forest fire. And I think of this as what happened in healthcare after World War II. You know, we had the NIH that was created that had this explosion of biomedical new knowledge, and we had growing specialization, we had a growing economy, and lots of investment in healthcare, and this huge growth, and then winners, and then a system that becomes increasingly ossified and gets to this vulnerable point here. And when that vulnerable point happens, something happens. In a forest, it might be a lightning strike. I don't know exactly what it's going to be in healthcare, but there's a lot of tinder around in healthcare. And so my sense is that we're at this conservation phase when you get this quick release phase where all this potential energy is released. And then there's this short reorganization phase that goes back to an exploitation phase. And so there's some strategies we can take if we understand healthcare not just as a pendulum or as things coming full circle or whatever other metaphor that we have, but if we understand it as a system that's going through these different phases. And the thing is that we think that this exploitation phase is the way the world normally works because this is the longest phase. These other phases happen really quickly. But we're somewhere, I think, up here. We're in this very vulnerable system that's widely acknowledged that it can't go on the way it is. It's unsustainable. And so there's some tinder here. And so what do we do strategically with this understanding? The tension a lot of us face in our personal lives, I think, and then professionally, and it's the same that a hospital CEO who's trying to become an accountable care organization faces, is we have to find some way to work in this system that's at this broken, brittle, vulnerable stage. At the same time, we might want to think about how can we plant some seeds so that when the big fire comes through, and how can we plant some seeds so we're ready to be able to be in a position to help those things to grow up in the next phase. So that's the tension we're in. And so how can we plant some seeds while we keep our mainstream burning platform that we're on right now? Well, the other thing I wanted to mention is that there are lots of these panarchies. There are lots of these cycles that happen, and there's cycles that are small and fast that often are where something goes in that creates this tipping point. And there are these long and slow cycles, and those tend to interact in this phase of regeneration in here. And so part of the point for this talk is actually to think about what are those fundamental things that we need to remember, and what are these short, fast cycles that we can do. And I would actually say the patient-centered medical home is one of these short, fast cycles. That plus accountable care organizations, we're trying to push this point here. How can we do that and not just get caught up, though, in this fast cycle? How can we keep some of these slow cycles, this deep knowledge, how can we have that go forward? So the last idea I want to present is some work that I'm doing with some colleagues that are really at the interface of what we do when we're working with communities. And it's the idea that we want to start with health. That we're not just about health care, I mean, that's our business, but what we're doing is really trying to advance health. And health is something that's something that enables people to do what's important in their lives. And then how do we work on that? We can work on that by working with a person in the family. We can work on that through primary health care, which is what we do. We can work on that by trying to make the healthcare system more functional. And we can do what's a major theme that I've seen at this conference. We can really work in public health and with our community partners. And what we do in family medicine is that we're boundary spanners. We help to create those conversations we've heard about that Rich Wender talked about. Rich said it all started with conversation. He actually said, don't mess with Sister Mary, but I wanted to say that, but it doesn't fit as well here. But I kind of like that phrase, don't mess with Sister Mary. But he said it's about conversations. And so the boundary between this person, the family, and what we do in primary health care is this personalized, prioritized health care. What we do when we're interacting with our healthcare system is trying to create healing environments, which is the opposite of what most people's experience of the healthcare system is now. When we're working with our community, we can help to work to create responsible, evolvable organizations. I was going to say sustainable, but we really don't want organizations that are sustainable in the current environment. We want organizations that can get by now and that are being built in ways that they can evolve in response to things being different. And then we want to work on healthy environments. And so the tension we have is even while we're doing healthcare is to try to reduce the sucking sound of healthcare on our resources and our energy and our attention and create some space for work on the social and environmental determinants of health and healthy environments. So as you think about your stories, as you think about what you're doing in your daily life, as you're thinking about how you have to keep one foot on the burning platform while you try to help see and move towards something better, I'd ask you to remember and to build on our generalist roots, and to remember that we're about both relationships and technology. And as people are starting to love us again, to not be seduced, and not to be offered trinkets, and not to just be happy with a little bit more money for paying for whatever the latest performance is, but to use that power for a larger good. To say, what do people really need? Do they need more of what we have to offer? Do they need more of what healthcare has to offer? Do they need something else? How can we use our platform that we have? I think we're going to find ourselves in a position of growing power. How do we use that for the larger good? How do we not be so wounded that we just take whatever's given to us, but that we push toward a larger good? How do we develop systems that support what's important? At the door, looks like they've been pushed into one chair, but there are some handouts, and that's an editorial series in the Annals of Family Medicine that talks about some of this stuff. The first article talks about the problem of fragmentation. The next one tells a story about the generalist approach. The next one talks about the paradox of primary care, which is lots of research comparing generalists to specialists and showing that generalists stink, that we provide poor disease quality care. But the paradox, and that's a lot of what we're working on to improve our disease-specific quality of care. The paradox, though, is that we help to create healthier people, healthier populations at less expenditure and less inequalities. So there's something that we're doing that's way beyond disease-specific care. We need to provide good quality disease-specific care. We need to remember what it is and figure out what it is that we're doing beyond that. And so that's the paradox, is moving beyond disease-specific care to this higher value. We talked about science of connectedness, these cycles that I talked about here, the ways of knowing, and then some ways to think about how we can regain our moral authority by probably making some personal sacrifices, but also by really working toward a larger good than our own self-interest. So we have a little time, I think, for some discussion. I'd ask you to use that time to maybe relay some of your stories. I'd love to, in the discussion or sending me an email, challenge some of these lenses if you think they really don't fit what seemed important about your story. So thanks very much thanks very much for getting up on the last day of the conference and coming at 8 o'clock. And thanks for listening. I'll look forward to your discussion here. So there's a microphone back there.
There's a microphone right over here.
Hey, Kurt, I'm probably the wrong person to get this started because we've had this conversation. But thank you for framing that in that way. You and I have many times had that conversation about, when you're doing it right, you can feel it, it's happening in the room. But it's so helpful to look at it that way and have a framework to discuss it and really promote our specialty. So one of the things I'd like to ask, you're challenging us, is to re-challenge us to how would you suggest that we use this framework to go out and promote? Because I think of promoting family medicine as positive for our patients and for society. So how would you suggest we do that?
I think one of the best ways, Leanne, we can promote family medicine is by not overtly promoting family medicine, is by looking at what are the larger problems that can't be solved by a fragmented, isolated approach, which is what most of our problem solving is. So what are the problems for which what we have to offer is a unique solution? And then working hard to make that offer. If you look at the patient-centered medical home, which is the big political thing that's on the table for us right now, it's a political construct. It's a deal that we're trying to broker where we say healthcare can't go on as it is, and we're actually part of the solution for healthcare, but we've become a little bit part of the problem, so we're going to change ourselves. In response to that, though, the healthcare system has to change what it does. But if we keep it just at that level, it's not going to work. We have to raise our gaze and say, and if that happens, what's the larger good that we're going to do? In the Future Family Medicine Project, when we were writing that up, there were 20 people in the room around the committee. I suggested once that in order to gain the moral authority to be able to ask to be paid differently, to have things change around us, that we needed to make a personal sacrifice. And I suggested that we all tithe for 3 years, that we all give up 10% of our income either to reinvest in our practices, to make that more patient-centered or relationship-centered, and for those of us, those who don't have practices, to put that toward a larger fund, to this larger good. And you want to make a room go silent. That was so dead on arrival, that idea. Really, there was 30 seconds of silence. Everybody looked around, and then the person who was leading the meeting just said, well, okay, the next item on the agenda is... but the idea that to set ourselves up so that we can make a little sacrifice, that we can afford to try some things and fail, and then do the next thing, I think is what we really have to do to be effective. Sorry, that was too long an answer. I'll be shorter.
Oh, that's all right. The slide that you showed with the circles and health in the middle sort of reminded me of a conversation that I had with Michael Fine yesterday. And I'm trying to now imagine a world where health is not in the center. And that maybe there's something else that lives in the center and that we should be thinking about. And maybe health needs to move out of there for a while. Did you ever think about that?
Yes. What would you put in there off the top of your head?
Well, right now it's knowledge and education.
Right. So I agree with you, and the work behind this actually gets around that by trying to have an incredibly broad definition of health, and actually uses Michael Fine's definition of health as one of the definitions. If we look at what makes people healthy, that is what enables them to do what's important in their life, what's meaningful for themselves and for society. Education is very high on the list. So I totally agree with you. What happens in the U.S. is we often see health and it gets co-opted by thinking of health care. But it's right.
We have time for 2 more questions. Sorry.
So I really appreciated a lot of your work on the science of connectedness, and was really struck that so much of medical education, we really focus on the knowing idea that this is all a knowing thing. And, I was really struck in this huge construct of what people found as healing relationships. That's such a small portion of that, but the majority of what we traditionally do in medical education. I was just interested in your thoughts. How do we start to move away from that and start to try to expand, I guess, either the teaching or experience or framework in which we're giving our students and residents?
Right. Well, the idea that we need to transcend and include the knowledge focus is important. So sometimes I think we get into trouble when we set ourselves up as different from that. Because if you're a student, you need to know that knowledge. But how do you use that knowledge in a way that's effective? So you're not just delivering these commodities of healthcare. So when people come in, you're not just saying, "Here's what I do. Let me do it to you." It's when I think the teachable moments are when people are starting to get a little bit of knowledge and they want to use it in a way that's effective and meaningful. So talking about how are we going to use this knowledge in a way that makes a difference for individual patients and then for fixing the healthcare system. Because what we really need to do are to be training change agents, people who just kind of jump over our decaying carcasses. At least I'll say that for myself. And so how we do that is to have them get this knowledge that's biomedical knowledge, but do the biotechnical knowledge and then add the biographical to it as well.
Thanks, Kurt. Always great to talk with you and hear from you. A question for you. On that media strip, the cycles of regeneration, what things would you recommend that we can be doing back home in our own lives to be both pushing us on over the edge at the top of that cliff in order to, because we really need to push us toward that change now and move into the fall. And also, what can we be doing in terms of what seeds are we not planting to be being ready for the regeneration stage?
Mm-hmm. So by the way, when you're in PowerPoint, you can hit the number of your slide and return, and it goes to that number, goes to that slide. I think it's a really challenging thing, because I think the general strategy is to first just try to be aware of where we are in the cycle and be aware of other cycles that are feeding into the healthcare cycle. So for example, Rich talked about all the stuff he was doing with his community. It's a similar thing in Cleveland. There's a lot going on in the community. And Jim and I were just talking about how do we do that bridge a little bit better. So just being aware of what's going on and about what's happening in other systems. So what's happening with the economy? What's happening where the U.S. is in this place of the world economy? As it becomes apparent that it's just not sustainable what we're doing, that's going to have a huge effect on health. And all the decision making is going to be about controlling costs. And so how can we, at the same time as we're saying, yes, we're the most cost effective, how we can make sure that we plant seeds for being effective. And when we have people's attention because we're lower cost, say, and we need to really reorganize how healthcare is done so that it's focused on relationships, not just on commodities. And so it's focused on relationships between healthcare and community organizations. So there's not a pat, easy answer, but the answer is to be aware of where we are in the cycle, to be aware of possible connections, to be aware of other cycles that are feeding into the healthcare cycle, and then to figure out where can we plant some seeds, and how can we keep using our burning platform at the same time as we develop other platforms. So, thanks.